Good. Hello guys, thanks for joining me. Today's video will be about sociology and modern day life, and in this mini sociology series we welcome back the return of Professor Dave Randall. So welcome back, Professor.
Hi there. Tariq. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. How are you? You keeping well?
Yeah, I'm okay.
Oh, fantastic. So the title, Sociology and Modern Day Life, I think that we are like social creatures, and kind of looking at our current situation being in COVID, people have really kind of started to appreciate more socializing and speaking with people. So Dave, so for our first question, do you think that, you know, looking at sociology and its nature, do you think its spirit is to really favor the underdog when we look at sociology?
Right, it depends on the sociology, of course. If you go back to the classics, i.e. Marx and Weber in particular, they were both in their quite similar ways interested in social class and social status. And so almost by definition, they were interested in not so much taking the side of the underdog. And Max Weber famously said that sociology should be value-free. Now, it doesn't mean everybody agrees with that. There are plenty of sociologists who do not agree that sociology should be value-free. The so-called critical sociologists, the critical race theorists and people of that sort, they certainly don't believe that sociology should be value-free. But Weber argued that if it's going to be value-free, it should nevertheless be value-relevant. So even Weber, who had a more or less objectivist view of what social life was like, he nevertheless thought that sociology should have an interest in the conditions that lead to inequality. Marx, of course, thought of himself, certainly the late Marx, thought of himself as a scientist. It's my view, again, people might disagree with me, but it's my view that the late Marx rather lost interest in what we might call sociology and got much more interested in economics. I think Marx, the late Marx, the Marx of Capital, Das Kapital, was much more interested in economic life. And he, at various points, famously said that he was neither a Marxist nor a sociologist. Somewhat odd for Marx to be arguing that he wasn't a Marxist. But what he meant was that he'd lost patience with the kind of humanistic activist version of Marxism. So even Marx arguably wasn't really on the side of the underdog in the sense that he thought that sociologists and people like them were engaged in changing the world. He was actually very contemptuous of what he thought of as bourgeois sociologists. Durkheim's very different. Durkheim again saw himself as an objective sociologist, or at least in my opinion. Though again, there are people who disagree with that, and wasn't very interested in inequalities, or less interested in inequalities. Durkheim was much more interested in the things that bind the world together, rather than the things that separate them. It was Durkheim who emphasized the normative nature of social life. You remember I said to you some time before that it's why Irving Goffman said that he was influenced by Durkheim, which on the face of it is extremely surprising. But it was because of Durkheim's interest in the things that bind us. He saw social life as essentially normative. Now that contrasts with what I will call the rational actor approach, or what used to be the rational man approach, which is the view that human beings act largely in the course of their own interest. So Durkheim was very keen to point out that this strong normative element to social life is very different from some universal rationality, which means people only act in their self-interest. So in terms of the classics, at very least you can say that sociologists by and large were interested in looking at issues of inequality and equality, but they differed in their opinions about how much it was their business to try to change things.
Yeah.
Now, later on, you can trace a long history of sociologies that are very, very concerned with activism, with the attempts to change various things and so on. The so-called cultural Marxists, who existed before, during, and after the Second World War, people like Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer, for instance, they were very much concerned with how do you go about changing things? How do you both explain the condition of modern life and the experience of alienation, as Marx called it in his earlier work, and how do you go about altering that?
So,
sorry, go on.
Oh, sorry, go on.
Well, I was going to say, and then you can carry on into certain kinds of contemporary sociology, which is the sociology concerned with identity. And there you see activism and sociology very closely interlinked in certain ways. I can't see how, for instance, you could be a critical race theorist without having some commitment to recognizing and trying to change the inequalities that racial differences bring. And in much the same way, it's very hard to imagine a feminist who isn't really very concerned with trying to promote more equality between the genders. Yeah. So I think that broadly Weberian attitude that we can be value neutral, we don't have to get involved in things. For a lot of sociology, that's gone. I think today most sociologists will accept you can't be value neutral. Howard Becker wrote a very famous paper some years ago called "Whose Side Are We On?", where he pretty much argued that it's impossible not to take a side. When you examine social life, you more or less have to take a side. And I do tend towards that view. There are right-wing sociologists, of course, but there aren't that many.
So Dave, would you say, I think you mentioned it, but do you think activism and sociology are like very compatible, or they go side by side?
Yes, I do. I think that Max Weber was very, very concerned with the relationship between fact and value. And I hold to the idea, despite what is sometimes called the postmodern approach. Postmodernism tried to, I think rather unsuccessfully, problematize the notion of a fact, wanted to challenge the idea of a fact. My view of this, along with the likes of Ian Hacking, is that it very much depends on what kind of fact you're talking about. You can quite clearly show that certain, that race is a social construction, for instance. It's not difficult to show that at all. And most sociologists would agree that there is no biology that explains racial difference. It can only be explained in terms of the way societies operate. Genetically, after all, genetically we share something like 97 point something genes with the great apes. We share roughly 60% of our genes with a cheese sandwich. Genetics doesn't explain human diversity. So if we think of things like race as being to do with difference, those differences can only exist for social reasons, not for biological reasons. Yeah. The same would be true of gender, the same would be true of sexuality. And the so-called social constructionists, that's very much their theme, that what we think of as objective social life always can be explained in terms of social facts, the way in which society constructs itself and the people in it.
That's quite interesting. So Dave, do you think sociology is anti-materialism?
I'm not quite sure. I saw that question on what you sent me. I'm not quite sure what you mean by materialism. Do you mean the commitment to consumerism, buying stuff?
Yeah, so like you know, like how in society there tends to be this idea of kind of projected: go to work, you know, get a business, earn lots of money, save, consume, buy lots of expensive things, go on holidays. Do you think sociology really kind of is against this kind of, you know, notion of materialism?
Not really. No, I think it can be critical. It can very clearly show that we live in a consumer society. That there can be very little doubt about that, and various sociologists have written extensively about the way in which consumption now comes to dominate social life. And incidentally, that is a kind of response to Marx. Marx, who saw social life as being almost entirely to do with production, to do with work, is precisely challenged by the notion that what motivates people in society today is not work but consumption. Now, to say that sociologists are against that would be a rather difficult argument. After all, to say that is to imply that sociologists choose to live in poverty. They choose not to buy cars. They choose not to live in nice houses. They choose not to earn professorial salaries and so on. And we know, if you'll excuse the language, that is bullshit. Yeah? They are as interested in doing well as anybody else. I think you could argue there is a branch of sociology which would assert that we need to change the way we live and be less materialistic. That would be what I would associate with, for instance, green sociology. There are sociologists who are very committed to green philosophy. Can't say I know any sociologists of that kind, but I do know at least one philosopher who very much tries to live his life along lines that have to do with green consumption. And sociologists are interested in these kinds of things. I know sociologists who study, for instance, veganism. I have some friends in Germany who have written papers on veganism. There's a lot of stuff about the green movement. Ulrich Beck, famously, the German sociologist, wrote a book called Risk Society, which was largely about the threat to the planet, which is evidently caused by global capitalism and so on, and how we might respond to it. So sociologists are clearly interested in the fact that we live in a consumer society. Do I take them seriously if they argue that there are alternatives? I think if they live their own lives that way, then yes. But I'm not at all convinced that many of them do. I don't. I mean, I'm not particularly materialistic in my life. I don't rush out to spend money on every available opportunity, but I live in a fairly nice house. I have plenty of money, and I don't avoid consumption. And I think most socialists are rather like me. They recognize that we live in a consumer society, but only a proportion of them are, and a relatively small proportion, are actually interested in trying to change that.
So Dave, you know, in your like kind of academic circles, and when you were lecturing at Manchester, would it be quite vulgar, do you think, if say one of the lecturers pulled up in like a Porsche or Bentley? Would that be kind of like frowned upon?
I would. I'm not so sure whether it would be vulgar, but I would be asking myself, where did he or she get their money from? Because I would not expect the average academic to be rich. You know, we live a middle class life as academics. We're not badly paid, not by any means, but neither are we millionaires by and large. There's the odd exception, and Anthony Giddens is a famous exception because he runs a publishing company. But there would be very few sociologists who get rich because they're sociologists. So you would be asking yourself, how does that happen? And there would be an argument that, of course, especially sociologists, like everybody else, they come equipped with an identity of some kind. And it it would be very hard to argue against the proposition that the vast majority of sociologists are, on the face of it, liberal or lefty in their convictions. And if you're a liberal lefty, one of the things you are unlikely to do is show off your consumption habits. So I think it would be unlikely that someone would turn up in a Bentley, A, because they don't have the money, and B, because they wouldn't want to be seen to be showing off their wealth.
Yeah. Okay, that's quite interesting. Okay, thanks. So the next.
I can't drive, by the way, so I don't even have a car.
Oh, you don't drive?
No, I don't. That's my excuse. My wife does. She ferries me about very kindly.
No. So, David, the next question is: if they were alive today, what do you think Marx, Weber, and Durkheim would make of the state of the world today?
Actually, I think all three of them would largely think that they were right. I think Marx would, the late Marx, and people have a very, very naive view of what Marx actually had to say. And the early Marx, which the textbooks all basically cite the Communist Manifesto, which he wrote when he was 25 years old. He was still a boy, really. And of course, it's very much geared to, workers of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains. The textbooks argue that Marx was wrong because he thought there would be a revolution, and that didn't happen, at least in the Western world it didn't, and so on. But the late Marx wasn't interested in that, and he, in my view, didn't believe that revolution was imminent. And certainly Engels after him clearly did not believe that revolution was imminent. What he did do in his later analysis was point to the inherent instabilities of capitalism. Now, most orthodox economists today would not want to argue against the idea that capitalism is inherently unstable. It clearly is. There are recessions, roughly speaking, some of which are very serious, somewhere between every 7 and then every 10 years in the modern world. And these recessions are caused, as Marx argued, by a combination of things, but they include things like overproduction, underconsumption, and so on. If Marx were looking at what's going on now, the effects of COVID on the modern economy, he would be saying, yeah, I foresaw that. That's very much what I thought would happen. So I think Marx would largely believe that he was right about the conduct of economic life and the nature of capitalism. He would, because he's a very smart guy, Marx, no question about it, a complete reprobate, but a smart guy, he would recognize that he made mistakes. But I think he would regard his analysis of economic life as broadly correct. In much the same way, I think Weber would be challenged by the sorts of things that I've spoken about, the collapse of the fact-value distinction. But he would look at a lot of contemporary sociology, and I think would argue that a lot of that contemporary sociology really is building on the shoulders of his arguments. I think he would point to the person who is arguably the most famous sociologist in the world today, who is Pierre Bourdieu, and he would say, well, actually, Pierre Bourdieu pretty much trades on the arguments about status that I first introduced. Bourdieu's argument is a lot more sophisticated than Weber's arguments about status, but I think I've always believed this, that Bourdieu largely is concerned with the kinds of things that Weber brought to our attention. Now, for Durkheim, I think Durkheim would be seriously challenged in respect of his methodology. Durkheim's methodology in the rules of sociological method is very much associated with statistical methods, quantitative analyses, and so on. Very, very objectivist, very much a kind of scientific approach to the study of society, and I think Durkheim would struggle with that today. Yeah, he would see that very little of contemporary sociology is interested in pursuing that line. Having said that, Durkheim also did other things, and some of the other things that he did still have a contemporary resonance. He was interested in symbolism, for instance, with his son-in-law, Marcel Mauss, and wrote books about language. Mauss wrote a book called The Gift, which is still cited today by people who work in my area, which has to do with technology. There are people who talk about the social media and see interaction in the social media in terms of gift giving. So some of Durkheim and Mauss's work certainly has a resonance today, but the stuff that Durkheim is famous for, the rules of sociological method, I think people today largely see them as wrong. And some of the work that followed on from that, his very famous work on suicide, for instance, I don't think anybody believes today that his arguments are correct there. I think everybody knows that they are wrong. The later work on the sociology of religion, I think that's still interesting for quite a lot of people. And as I say, his work on language and symbols, I think, is still interesting for a lot of people today.
Yeah. But also, Dave, it's been quite a while since I've taught sociology, but was Durkheim a structuralist?
No, not in the contemporary sense of the word structuralist. I mean, again, it's a difficult word. Is structuralism? It means a lot of different things. The contemporary as in post, say, 1970 kinds of structuralism largely came out of the linguistics of people like Saussure, Ferdinand de Saussure, and then became in the hands of a lot of French sociologists about things like imagery. Lévi-Strauss, the anthropologist, is famously a structuralist because he was very interested in the way that social life reflects certain assumptions we have in the way that we think about both the social and the natural world. But I've always struggled with the word structuralism because it means a lot of different things. And post-structuralism, as it is sometimes called, which I think is broadly equivalent to postmodernism, again was a kind of a reaction to this notion that there is some kind of universal overarching truth which is there in all societies, even though more superficially societies vary excuse me, from place to place. That's one of the key elements, I think, of structuralism, this idea that behind local variation there is some overarching universal social property. I think the post-structuralists have largely disposed of that idea.
Okay. Well, thank you for that, Dave. Well, kind of moving on to a slightly different kind of theme. I don't know if you got Netflix. There's a.
I do have Netflix. Yeah.
Oh, excellent. Well,
doesn't everybody?
Yeah. There's a sci-fi drama called Black Mirror, and you may have seen it.
I've seen some of it. Yeah, I've seen some of it.
Oh, excellent. Well, there's one episode there. It's about mobile phones, and basically, people use their mobile phones to rate each social interaction. So, if they go to the shop, they kind of give it out of 5 stars. What do they think of the customer service? So essentially, this becomes like the new financial and social currency, which creates really false, insincere, and artificial society, because people are basically worried about what their ratings are. Are we at the beginning of such a path? And do you think social media kind of is eroding authentic face-to-face communication? And part of this has been borne out by, I've read that in China they've started to implement some of this.
I was about to say exactly that. The Chinese have implemented a social credit system, it's called, where you actually get scored and on various things that you do, both positively and negatively. And it is a social control system, no question. It is a way of controlling the population. China's a very interesting country because it's become much more repressive in the last 10, 15 years under Xi. It actually showed every sign of slightly liberalizing 15 years ago and has become a lot more repressive.
Yeah.
And the social credit system, I think, is an example of that. But that's, there's a difficulty with this, and the difficulty is whether that means that somehow the world is less authentic than it used to be. Because I don't think it does. I think it means that the world is different from what it used to be. But I don't think the world was ever authentic in the sense that we only ever told the truth to each other, or we were never interested in the presentation of self and so on. I think we always were. To give you an example of this, one of the last courses I ever taught when I was at MMU, somewhat bizarrely to people who know me, was a course on fashion.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that interested me about fashion, lots of things interest me about fashion, although, as is obvious, I'm not someone who is a dedicated follower of fashion. But you can go back into the Middle Ages and right up to 17th and 18th century, and you will see what were called the sumptuary laws. The sumptuary laws actually made it illegal for certain classes of people to wear certain classes of clothing. Only certain classes of people were allowed to wear certain kinds of clothes. Now, that is nothing but the presentation of self. So 3-4 centuries ago, people were behaving in that, what you call inauthentic way, ways of presenting themselves to be of a certain kind of person. And let's face it, social media is engaged in doing exactly the same kind of thing. Its consequences may be different. There's a lot of debate about the effects of the social media. I tend to be of the view that the effects of the social media are rather less than some people think. Again, you can trace in sociology a history of the so-called moral panic. And you can trace it right back to the 1940s, where right-wing commentators in the USA talked at length about the threat that comic books posed to the nation's youth. After that, it was television, the effects that TV programs posed to the nation's youth, and so on and so forth. And today, it's the social media.
Yeah.
In every instance, I think that this notion of threat was ridiculously exaggerated. I think that people use the social media for the purposes that they have, and you can think of it as, roughly speaking, I do, as sometimes a bit silly. I do wonder why people are influenced by influencers and so on, and to some extent, the world has passed me by, and I don't fully understand the likes of TikTok and Instagram and WhatsApp and so on. I stopped at Facebook, and that dates me. It's a commonplace that nobody young is on Facebook anymore. It's only older people who are on Facebook now. But so what? I mean, what effect does it have? And I think the answer is probably less than most of us believe. I don't think there's any sense in which it's inauthentic. I think people are doing exactly what they always did, which is the presentation of self. It's identity work. That was always there, at least in the modern world, and always will be there. I tend to think of it as not that consequential. Now, when you get on to the issue of politics and the social media, that's a different issue. I still am fairly cautious about its influence. I still tend towards the view that its influence is exaggerated. I think those people who believe that Donald Trump is president of the United States because of social media are very, very naive in their views. I think they ignore the deep anger that many Americans had about the fact that their standard of living had not gone up for 20 years and in many instances had gone down. The fact that the simple business of going to university for a lot of young Americans had become extraordinarily expensive. The fact that Hillary Clinton was a bad candidate, and the fact that the American electoral system meant that even though she got 3 million more votes than Donald Trump, he still got elected. In other words, you can believe in the effects of the social media only as long as you ignore all the other effects of other things. Yeah, I think a lot of the emphasis on the social media ignores a lot of other features of social life. I don't believe that the world is less authentic than it used to be. I think we are still largely motivated by the same basic things. We're motivated by status, by money, by identity, and so on. I don't think the world has changed in that respect. I think the things that give us status, the things that give us our identity, the things that give us money have changed. You can make a lot of money as an influencer now because of the existence of social media, which you couldn't, of course, do 30 years ago, but that's only a change in the detail. Yeah, some people can make a lot of money by being influencers. Some people can make a lot of money by being professional footballers. Most people make money by doing the same broad things that they always did, i.e. working for a living.
But Dave, but if we went into a society which was the social credit system, where so for each interaction you get like points, do you think that would make people, they'll be scared to be more truthful because there's kind of more consequences to their actions?
I tend towards the view, I mean, that's a difficult thing to answer because it's kind of predicting the future.
Yeah.
And one thing I know about sociology is every time it tries to predict the future, it's wrong. And I don't really want to get into that game. I think for the most part, the majority of people are mainly concerned with getting on with their lives. I think for the most part, wider issues of race, gender, the green movement, global warming, desertification, COVID, and so on, affect them only when it has a direct impact on their lives. Funnily enough, I gave a very short lecture last week to a workshop in Sweden, online obviously, and it was supposed to be about the effects of COVID on modern life. And I pointed out that COVID is just one thing. I asked the question of the PhD students who were attending this, what was the last pandemic? The one that killed 1.35 million people in 2019. And they all said the flu, which is wrong. And I kind of was misleading them by using the word pandemic. But 1.35 million people were killed in 2019 by motor cars. Now, still today, less than that number have been killed by COVID worldwide. The figure, I think, at the moment is about 750,000 people. And it's estimated, for instance, that if global warming continues at the rate that we're seeing currently, something like 50 million people will be forced to leave the habitat that they currently inhabit. Right across North Africa, the Middle East, and so on. If you are one of those people that believe that there is a problem with migration at the moment, just wait, because in 10 or 20 years we are going to be looking at much, much, much greater patterns of migration. Yeah, I think there are serious things to worry about in the world. But I think notions of things like social credit systems are probably not one of them, because the vast majority of people would toe the line quite happily. They wouldn't care. There will be that minority group of people who are politically active, who are sensitive to various kinds of social and political issues, who will care. But they will be a minority. I don't see the whole world turning out to join Black Lives Matter protests. Yeah. I see small groups of people and on occasion bigger groups of people turning out to protest. But most people in the end can't be bothered, even if they're sympathetic to that kind of political movement. It's too much trouble. And I think that kind of thing motivates people much more than concern with what the future might look like. As long as they're economically okay, as long as their kids are okay, and so on, they're not going to care much. It's a very cynical view, I know, but it is what I think.
Because David, we do have some aspects of social credit system. Do you think there could be some more kind of sinister motives behind, like social control with only certain people allowed to get certain credits?
Well, yes and no. I mean, I'm giving a personal view. I'm not giving a view as a professional sociologist here. This is just an opinion. We've always had social control. Social control is necessary because without it, there would be a kind of anarchy that we would not like. Yeah, and social control is possible in lots of different ways. You can send out the army. You can send out the tanks. That's social control. Yeah, and various Marxists have pointed out that there is both coercive social control of that kind, and then there is a kind of cultural control that you can operate, which you can operate through ideological means, through the media, through things like social credit systems and so on, which is clearly what Xi in China is attempting. Do I think that there is something new and especially dangerous about this? Not really. I mean, you would have to believe that the world is going to change in such a way that life will be much more difficult for most people to want to argue that, rather than arguing that life will become much more difficult for certain categories of people. And because I'm a lefty myself, I am one of the people who is very worried about the direction the world is taking in respect of things like race, and in respect of things like gender, and particularly in respect of things like economic inequality. I do care about these things, but I don't think most people do. And I don't see much evidence that they ever will. I think, how do I put this without basically it being polemical? I find it extraordinary that the Tories won the last election. I do. I find it absolutely extraordinary. It seems to me that the Labour Party was blamed for all the things that the Tories have been doing wrong for the last 10 years. And then I remind myself that people of my age get a state pension. My wife gets a state pension. That state pension is worth over £1,000 every 4 weeks between us. It's worth something like £1,100 between us every 4 weeks. We both have occupational pensions, which are worth a great deal more than the state pension. I'm not going to tell you what our net income is in a month, but let me put it this way. We are very comfortable. And most people of my age are very, very happy with the idea that this level of comfort will continue. The biggest problem Theresa May had when she was the leader of the Tory party, when she made the mistake of telling old people that they may have to pay for their own social care. And it almost lost her an election. Like many people, old people want all the benefits of social life, of the National Health Service, etc., but they're not particularly keen on paying for it. And most people are like that. They want to keep what they've got. And if you want to understand why the Tories won the last election, people like me are the wrong people to look at. The right people to look at are all those elderly folk, some 75% of whom voted Tory in the last election, who are basically concerned with their pensions, keeping their property, because of course they've seen the value of houses rise dramatically in the last 20 to 30 years. They live in houses worth a great deal of money now. I live in a semi-detached house. It's a nice house, but it's nothing wonderful. It's worth more than £500,000. And you think, that is ridiculous. But people want to keep that. They want to pass it on to their kids. They don't want to pay inheritance tax and so on. These are the things that motivate ordinary folk. Ordinary folk are motivated largely by keeping what they've got. Yeah? People like me who are lefties, and we believe in a more just society, and we want to see greater freedom. I'm quite libertarian, broadly speaking, in my attitudes. We're very unusual. And we make that mistake all the time of thinking that other people are like us when they're not.
But Dave, because you've worked all your life and you've paid your taxes, I think it's right, though, that society should value and look after people who've contributed so much over
But that's
the
why I
years.
get wages. I mean, this is my brother-in-law uses this argument. When I say to him that pensions are a social benefit, they're a benefit, he wants to argue they're not a benefit. And he says they're not a benefit because he's paid taxes all his life. My answer to which is I am old enough to remember when in this country we had unemployment benefit, which no longer exists. Yeah, it's called universal credit now. We used to have unemployment benefit. Not everybody got unemployment benefit. In order to qualify for unemployment benefit, you had to have paid what back in those days were called stamps. Put simply, you had to have worked for a living.
Yeah.
It didn't stop people calling it a benefit. It was a benefit. And pensions and related payments to old age pensioners constitute something like 60% of the total amount spent on social security and social services in this country, way more than payments to the unemployed. Now, my view is I did quite nicely, thank you, out of working for a living. I got this thing called a salary, and I had a contributory pension. I paid into it, so did my employer, the net result of which is I have a quite nice occupational pension. And I don't accept the argument that I deserve a state pension merely because of the fact that I've worked all my life. A lot of other people, there is a feminist argument, for example, which goes that lots and lots of women have worked all their lives, but they worked in the home, not in a factory or not in an office. And so they are not entitled to the state pension.
Yeah.
Well, I'm rather on the side of those women. I think that just because you didn't do paid work, the idea that you're not entitled to a state pension is utterly awful. It's dreadful. Yeah. I don't think I deserve a state pension, but hey, I'm just like all those other old people. I keep it. Well, I don't. I give quite a lot of it away, but I keep a proportion of it. Yeah. What's the plot here? The plot is whether the world will change because of things like social credit systems and so on, whether social control will become greater. I think it ebbs and flows. I think there are times when anxieties of one kind or another lead to greater social control, and then times when we become more liberal. I mean, if you think about it, the world is a great deal more liberal about some matters than it used to be. You think about the experience of people with who are not, as the sociologists like to say, heteronormal, i.e. they're gay or lesbian or what have you. We are much, much more liberal about sexual preference than we used to be. Social control does not lead to a concern with sexual normality. Yeah, we are much happier about that than we used to. I like to think, although I'm not entirely sure that I'm right, that we are much more liberal about matters of race. That levels of prejudice are not as high as they were in, say, the 1950s. I'm not sure I'm correct about this, but I would like to think that. There are ways in which the world is more liberal than it used to be, and one would imagine that if social control were being applied universally across every aspect of social life, then that would not be true. In many respects, we still live in a very liberal society. We still are free to do an awful lot of things, and I don't think that's changed a lot. And I doubt if it will. Could be wrong.
Yeah.
Let me say one last thing. If sociology has any value at all, and I'm not always convinced it does, but if it has any value at all, its value lies in understanding the difference between a fact and an opinion, understanding the difference between evidence and speculation. There is a big difference between what sociologists have to say about things and what your average person in a pub has to say about things. I've said some things today which I think are academically justified, but I've also said some things that are just opinion. And when people listen to this, one of the things they need to do is understand which is which. Yeah.
Okay, lovely. Well, again, thank you so much, Dave. So please like, share and subscribe, and until next time, take care. Bye-bye.
Okay, take care now.
Bye-bye.